What timeline are we living in that we're somehow managing to get 3 Mario RPGs in the span of a year? Super Mario RPG's remake was a really nice and welcome surprise in and of itself, but also getting a remake for what is probably the most beloved Mario RPG ever, and an entirely new Mario and Luigi game later this year? I mean, I honestly couldn't be happier right now, especially since I've never actually played the Thousand Year Door. Out of all the Mario RPG series, Paper Mario is the one I have by far the least experience with. The first one I played was Sticker Star, which went about as well as you'd expect to anyone who knows that game at all, but later on I did play Super Paper Mario, which was a much better experience. As far as the more traditional turn-based games are concerned, I've either never gotten around to them, like with Paper Mario 64, or in the case with the Thousand Year Door, I've just never had the chance until now. And after playing it for the first time, I gotta say, I can pretty easily see why it's heralded as a masterpiece and so beloved. Heck, if I'm being totally honest here, with the Switch version's improvements, I could even understand why some people might argue it's a near-perfect game. So join me while I explain in a lot more detail exactly why I love Paper Mario the Thousand Year Door. The story of the Thousand Year Door, like most of the Mario RPGs, doesn't go the way things normally do for this franchise. During her trip to a town called Rogueport, Peach comes across a merchant who gives her a box containing an ancient map that can locate the crystal stars, 7 objects needed to open a 1,000-year-old door that's said to contain a legendary treasure. Shortly after, though, Peach is kidnapped by a group of people called the X-Nauts, who are after the legendary treasure for themselves, who are also, for unknown reasons, holding the princess hostage at their HQ. Thankfully, Mario was headed to Rogueport anyway to help out with finding the treasure after Peach sent him the map via letter beforehand. So Mario's goal is twofold: find the crystal stars before the X-Nauts, and figure out where Peach is and save her. The humor and charm in the Thousand Year Door's writing is about what you'd expect from a Mario RPG. Those parts are as consistently funny and great as usual, like this one fourth wall breaking bit in Chapter 5 that, let me tell ya, I was not prepared for. I also wasn't at all prepared for the weird bit with Hooktail where she offers to let Mario sniff her feet in exchange for mercy. Like, I'm not one to shame people for their tastes, but that was very much a the writer's barely disguised fetish moment. That being said though, the Thousand Year Door also has a surprising amount of great and even creative twists in it. There were also a few aspects of the story that were both strangely beautiful and actually had me feeling genuinely sad. Like, I am not ashamed to admit that Bobbery's entire part of the story during the prelude to Chapter 5 almost got tears out of me. Obviously, I can't go into more depth about all of that for spoiler reasons, but the main point here is that the Thousand Year Door's overall story is honestly one of the better ones when it comes to the Mario RPGs. Usually they're at least good, thanks partly to what I said before about their charm and sense of humor, but I've rarely had a Mario game story make me feel the way this one has. That being said though, unlike the Mario and Luigi games, Paper Mario's story is broken up into multiple chapters like I've sort of mentioned before. Every chapter is pretty different from the other, and frankly, I could totally see most of them being somebody's favorite. Honestly, I'm not sure which one I'd choose as my favorite though, because I love a lot of them pretty equally. Chapter 3 had a pretty unique setup, with the premise of it being that Mario has to become the champion of the Glitz Pit to get the Crystal Star, all while solving a mystery surrounding the strange disappearances of its fighters. Also, this is the chapter where you get Yoshi, and I love this little guy. Chapter 4 probably has the worst case of backtracking in the Switch version, with how many times you need to go back and forth between the creepy steeple and Twilight Town. That being said though, it has some pretty great and well-executed ideas for the story, and it has one of my favorite partners in Vivian, so I can forgive all of that. Relevant side note, by the way, while I haven't played this game until now, I did know about Vivian's character beforehand, and I really appreciate that they were more upfront about her being trans in the new localization. I think it's great that this part of her character isn't censored at all in the English version anymore, and while I myself am not trans at all, I think it's great representation for those who are. It also by extension makes me hate how Beldam mistreated her even more, but with her being a villain, that's definitely not a bad thing at all. The biggest contender for my favorite would probably have to go to Chapter 5 though. Chapter 5 has my actual favorite partner in the game with Bobbery, probably one of my favorite overall cast of characters for a chapter, and easily one of my favorite bosses with the undead pirate Cortez. Really, the whole thing is just a joy to go through for me. If I had to criticize anything about the story though, and by extension the game's level design, I'd have to say it does still have a problem with backtracking. The Switch version did a lot to correct this thanks largely to the new warp pipe room in Rogueport, but there's still a good few moments where you'll have to go back to previous parts of the same area, like in chapters 2, 4, and even 5 to progress the story. Like I said though, it is still way better compared to what it was like in the GameCube version, which I appreciate, but with how baked in some of these sections are, the problem does still unfortunately persist in the Switch version to some degree. But if you're a Metroidvania fan like I am, this shouldn't bother you too much. Now, as far as the presentation goes, visually speaking, I gotta say, the Thousand Year Door's visuals got a pretty great upgrade from the original. The Switch version feels like a perfect combination between the older art style for the series and the more modern style from the newer games, which I really like. I really enjoy the creativity that can come from games with arts and crafts visuals, like with Kirby's Epic Yarn or Yoshi's Woolly World. But I also know that some people weren't a fan of how heavy the newer Paper Mario games leaned into it, so to me, this feels like a really great compromise for those who do and don't like said styles. As for the soundtrack though, I mean come on, it's a Mario game, of course it's great. Honestly, at this point, I'd expect nothing less from this series. All of the music was redone for the remake, with there even being some new songs like this really great new battle theme that honestly sounds like something from a Castlevania game. While this'll come down to taste, I kinda prefer the new OST over the original, for how much more grand it feels in comparison. And I think some songs were actually made even better here, like the theme for Chapter 3's boss, which will remain nameless to avoid spoilers. As for the gameplay though, this part of the Thousand Year Door's remake was touched the least because honestly it didn't really need it that much. Outside of combat, you'll be exploring Rogue Port and its surrounding areas using Mario's own abilities and his partners, for shine sprites to upgrade your partners with more health, damage, and abilities, and badges for Mario, which we'll get more into later. Something nice the remake added for partners is the ability to swap them with a shortcut wheel this time around instead of having to go into the menu, which is something I'm honestly surprised wasn't in the original version at all. That being said though, aside from Goombella's ability to tell you more about where you're at and other NPCs, the partners and even most of Mario's abilities are pretty straightforward and don't need to be discussed or explained at all. I gotta say though, the curses are pretty great, with them being a set of pretty creative traversal abilities that take advantage of the whole Mario being paper aspect of the game and having a pretty funny context surrounding them. Basically, the idea is that Mario always gets cursed by these evil spirits after unlocking these black chests. But despite being framed as this horrific and painful fate Mario has to endure, much to their delight, they're nothing but helpful, and the whole joke has a really great payoff that for obvious reasons I won't talk about. Now as for the combat itself though, it's of course a very different beast compared to other Mario RPGs. In battle, your main party consists of Mario and whatever partner he has out at the moment, with the Thousand Year Door, just like Mario and Luigi, also carrying over aspects of Super Mario RPG with action commands, a mechanic I absolutely adore. The beauty of turn-based RPGs that use action commands in some form, like how the Mario RPGs do, is that it creates a perfect way to help keep the player engaged with combat, and it even adds extra layers of skill to it, especially in faster-paced ones like with the Mario and Luigi series. Compared to that series though, the Thousand Year Door is pretty different, and I'm not just saying that because you have a live audience, but more on that fun detail later. For starters, your health and other stats are a lot smaller than in other RPGs. Heck, aside from HP, Mario's other stats like attack and defense can only increase with badges or the few times you get hammer and boot upgrades. Combat in the Thousand Year Door is slow-paced, and while it still has a similar level of focus on you learning about enemies to know what kind of attacks can or should be used and how to mitigate or avoid damage, it puts more of an emphasis on strategy, resource management, and your loadout with the badges. The badges are incredibly important, with them being able to give you increased stats, passive bonus effects, and they even give Mario new attacks to use in combat. In fact, aside from when you get new boots or a hammer, these will be how you get new moves at all. At least for the most part, because Mario does have special skills he'll learn over the course of the game that require star points to use, with him getting a new one every time he gets a crystal star. A couple of these I personally didn't feel the need to use, but I did get plenty of use out of about half of them, such as Sweet Treats, which was great for if I needed a little pick-me-up for my health and FP, with this also extending to its much stronger version, Sweet Feasts. Then there's Earth Tremor, which was a great way of dealing heavy damage to enemies early on, with Art Attack and Supernova being even better, albeit more expensive with your star points. This brings us to one of my favorite parts about the Thousand Year Door's combat, with that live audience I mentioned a moment ago. Yeah, for some reason, fights in this game always take place on a stage with a live audience as if it were some kind of play, but honestly, I kinda love this. It's a super creative and fun way of presenting combat in a game like this. In order to fill your star gauge to get points, you have to successfully perform action commands or appeal to the crowd, but how much you get is determined by the size of your audience, with your maximum size being raised by 50 when your stage upgrades every 10th level until you reach 200. You can actually get even more star points though by performing stylish moves, which you can get by pressing the A button at a specific moment after a character finishes their action command, which is honestly just a nice touch, what with Mario having an audience and all. While we're still on the note of the stage though, there are some other mechanics to keep note of. You'll have moments where audience members can give you helpful items or even throw things at you if you don't stop them, but you can even have stage props fall on enemies or you, albeit rarely, after using certain attacks, with more hazards appearing as the stage upgrades. I mean, on the whole, the combat is just great. The action commands make battles consistently engaging, I love the way it presents everything with the stage gimmick, and while I prefer the battle system for something like the Mario and Luigi games, I still had a lot of fun with this. Honestly, I'm genuinely having a hard time coming up with things to criticize about it. Some partners are better or worse than others, like Yoshi and unfortunately Flurry, but I wouldn't consider that a big problem at all. And while I'm not a fan of how easily you can just dump most of your levels into BP, that could easily be a more personal thing, having played Bug Fables first, which is honestly just a harder game overall. Really, the only thing I can kinda see as a criticism is the 1000-Year Door being kinda easy, but even that's subjective. This video's been almost nothing but positivity, and honestly, that's pretty much because I genuinely don't have many criticisms for this game. I mean, seriously, Paper Mario the 1000-Year Door all around is an RPG so incredibly solid that I have very few negative things to say about it. And honestly, that's the biggest reason overall why I love this game and why I'm with fans on it being a masterpiece. There's the backtracking, sure, but the remake mitigated it to a point where I'd argue it's a fairly minor issue now. The 1000-Year Door is just a joy from start to end. It's funny and incredibly charming. The story's really good, and it's got some of my favorite moments in a Mario RPG. And while I prefer Mario and Luigi's combat and to a degree Bug Fables for a much closer comparison, I really loved what they did here. Whether the series will return to its RPG roots in the future, who can say? But in my opinion, the fact that they chose to give a full-on remake to this game at all, I think bodes well for the possibility. But until then, at least we have Mario and Luigi again. Thank you all for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I hope you all have a nice day.